Aisha Aande reclined on her queen-sized bed, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone. The walls of her room were adorned with paintings worth more than some people's annual salaries. Her ceiling was a delicate pattern of gold and white, illuminated by a chandelier that sparkled like the sun itself. Aisha's room was a haven of luxury, with velvet curtains draping tall windows that overlooked the sprawling Aande estate. Her mother, Dr. Bose Aande, was a revered lecturer at Olabisi Onabanjo University. Her father, Chief Kunle Aande, was a powerful politician whose influence stretched across the southwestern states. Together, they had built an empire, and Aisha was its princess. She never lacked anything, from designer clothes to trips abroad for summer vacations. "Aisha, come downstairs," her mother's sharp voice echoed through the house. Aisha groaned but obeyed. Descending the marble staircase, she found her mother in the expansive living room, impeccably dressed in an Ankara gown adorned with Swarovski crystals. Dr. Bose exuded an aura of sophistication and authority. "What is it, Mum?" Aisha asked, adjusting the hem of her designer dress. "Your father called. He needs us at his campaign office in Lagos this weekend," Bose replied, her tone firm. "There's a dinner to raise funds, and he wants you there." "But I plan to go to Dubai with Kemi and Sade," Aisha protested, crossing her arms. "Cancel it. This is important for your father's career. Besides, you can go to Dubai anytime," her mother snapped, her piercing eyes silencing further arguments. Aisha sighed and flopped onto the sofa. "Fine, but I don't see why I have to be there." "Politics isn't my thing," Bose softened her tone. "It's not about politics, Aisha. It's about family. Your father's success ensures our life stays this way." "Like we'd ever go broke," Aisha muttered under her breath. Her mother hesitated before responding, her gaze momentarily distant. "Life can change, Aisha. Quickly. Never take anything for granted." Later that evening, Aisha joined her parents for dinner in their opulent dining room. Her father, Chief Kunle Aande, was a charismatic man whose booming laughter often filled the house. Tonight, however, he was unusually quiet, his brow furrowed as he checked his phone repeatedly. "Daddy, are you okay?" Aisha asked, slicing into her steak. Kunle looked up and forced a smile. "Of course, my dear. Just the usual political nonsense. You know how these things go." Bose exchanged a glance with her husband, a silent conversation passing between them. Aisha noticed, but chose not to press further. Instead, she steered the conversation to lighter topics, talking about her upcoming graduation ceremony and her plans to study fashion design in Paris. "You're our pride and joy, Aisha," her father said, his smile finally reaching his eyes. "Everything we've done for you," Aisha grinned, "and I plan to make you both proud." That night, Aisha lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her parents' words lingered in her mind, especially her mother's warning about life changing quickly. She had always seen her family as untouchable, shielded by wealth and influence. Yet, there was an undercurrent of tension she couldn't ignore. Just as she began to drift off to sleep, a commotion from downstairs jolted her awake. She rushed to the window and saw several black SUVs pulling up to the house. Men in suits spilled out, their movements deliberate and menacing. Her heart raced as she heard her father's voice shouting, followed by her mother's frantic pleas. Aisha crept downstairs, her silk nightgown trailing behind her. Peeking into the living room, she saw her father facing a man in a sharp suit. His calm demeanor contrasted with Kunle's obvious distress. "You think you can just walk away, Chief Aande?" the man said, his voice dangerously low. "There's a price for everything, and you know what you owe. You'll pay it. Just give me more time," Kunle pleaded, his usual confidence replaced by desperation. The man smirked. "Time? Time doesn't erase debts, Chief. It only increases the interest." Bose stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Please, let's handle this privately. Our daughter—" "Your daughter will inherit the consequences of your actions if you don't comply," the man interrupted, his gaze flicking briefly toward the staircase. Aisha's breath hitched, and she stumbled back, accidentally knocking over a vase. The sound shattered the tension in the room as all eyes turned toward her. "Aisha, go back to your room," her father barked, his tone sharper than she'd ever heard. "But Daddy—" Now, Kunle's voice was unyielding, tears streaming down her face. Aisha obeyed, retreating to her room. She locked the door and sat on the floor, her mind racing. For the first time, she questioned the source of her family's wealth. What debts? What had her father done? The luxurious walls of her life felt like they were closing in, and Aisha realized her perfect world might not be as perfect as it seemed. The next morning, Aisha woke to an eerie silence. The usual hum of activity in the Aande household was absent. She checked her phone, no messages from her father or mother. Frowning, she slipped out of bed, wrapping a silk robe around herself, and padded downstairs. "Daddy?" she called, her voice echoing in the cavernous house. No answer. In the living room, her mother sat on the plush sofa, her face pale and her hands trembling as she gripped a teacup. "Mummy, where's Daddy?" Aisha asked, her voice laced with worry. Bose didn't look up. "Hes, gone, Aisha." "What do you mean gone? Now, he left for Lagos early?" "No." Bose's voice cracked. "Your father is missing." Aisha's legs felt weak and she sank into the nearest chair. "Missing? How? When? Did you call the police?" "Yes, I did. They've been here since dawn," Bose replied, her voice heavy. "They think he's been kidnapped, but no ransom call has come. They're looking into it." "Kidnapped?" Aisha echoed, her heart pounding. "Why would someone take him? He's Chief Aande." Her mother shot her a sharp look, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "That's precisely why, Aisha. Your father's position makes him a target." Days turned into weeks, and still there was no word from Kunle Aande. The authorities conducted interviews, tapped phones, and reviewed CCTV footage, but every lead fizzled out. The black SUVs that had visited the house that fateful night were untraceable, and the men in suits had vanished, as if they'd never existed. At first, Aisha held on to hope. She imagined her father walking through the door, his signature grin lighting up the room. But as time passed, hope gave way to despair. One evening, Aisha found her mother sitting at the dining table, poring over stacks of bills. The sight was jarring. Bose Aande, always so composed and elegant, now looked haggard and defeated. "Mummy, are you okay?" Aisha asked, cautiously approaching. Bose sighed deeply, rubbing her temples. "I'm trying to figure out how well manage, Aisha. Your father handled everything. This house, the cars, your tuition. My salary alone can't sustain it all." Aisha blinked, stunned. "But we're rich. We have investments, properties. All tied to your father," Bose interrupted. "And without him, we're losing everything. The creditors are circling, Aisha. We have debts I didn't even know existed." "Debts?" Aisha's voice rose in disbelief. "Yes. Your father, he wasn't as transparent as I thought," Bose admitted, her voice breaking. The first casualty of their crumbling fortune was the housekeeper, followed by the cook and driver. Aisha watched as her childhood home slowly emptied, piece by piece. The luxury cars were sold, the private jet grounded. By the time Aisha's university graduation came around, the Aande family mansion had been put on the market. The final blow came when Bose sat Aisha down one evening. "We have to move," she said softly. "Move where?" Aisha asked, though she already knew the answer. "To a smaller place," Bose replied. "I've found a 2-bedroom apartment. It's nothing like this, but it's all we can afford now." Aisha's chest tightened. "Mummy, this isn't fair. We didn't do anything wrong." "Didn't we?" Bose muttered under her breath, but Aisha caught it. "What do you mean?" Bose looked at her daughter, tears brimming in her eyes. "Your father, he made his money in ways I didn't question. I didn't want to know, and now we're paying the price." Moving day was a surreal experience. Gone were the movers and the army of staff that used to handle such tasks. Aisha and Bose packed their belongings themselves, cramming years of opulence into a few suitcases. Their new home was a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse. For the first time in her life, Aisha experienced what it meant to live without abundance. One evening, Aisha came home to find her mother sitting in the dark, a bottle of wine in her hand. "Mummy, you're scaring me," Aisha said, switching on the light. "I failed you," Bose whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No, you didn't. None of this is your fault," Aisha replied, kneeling beside her. Bose shook her head. "I should have asked questions, Aisha. I should have stopped your father from making deals with devils." Aisha froze. "What are you saying?" "Daddy wasn't." "I don't know everything," Bose admitted, "but I know enough. Your father's wealth came with a price, and now it's taken him from us." The weight of her mother's words settled heavily on Aisha. The life she had always believed to be perfect was built on a foundation of lies. As she lay in her tiny room that night, Aisha stared at the ceiling, the cracks in the plaster mirroring the fractures in her own life. For the first time, she wondered if she ever truly knew her father and if she could ever escape the shadow of his choices.
Aisha stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the only designer dress she had managed to save during their move. It was a soft, peach-colored gown that once turned heads at high-profile events. Now it felt out of place. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind. Aisha, I don't think going to these parties is a good idea anymore. But Aisha needed to cling to the life she had before, her friends, their laughter, and the glamorous events that had defined her identity. Tonight's soirée, hosted by her best friend Kemi, was a chance to feel normal again. The Aande name still carried weight in the circles Aisha moved in, but the whispers were becoming harder to ignore. As she entered Kemi's house, a sprawling mansion lit up like a beacon. The familiar rush of envy and admiration she used to receive was absent. Heads turned, but not in the way she had hoped. Aisha! Kemi greeted her, air kissing her cheek. Her tone was bright, but there was an edge to it, a mix of pity and discomfort. Kemi, it's been ages, Aisha said, forcing a smile. You didn't even call after everything. Kemi shrugged, her smile faltering. I was busy with my wedding plans, you know. Anyway, come in. Everyone's in the garden. The garden was a scene straight out of a magazine, with fairy lights strung across the trees and waiters serving champagne. Aisha spotted familiar faces, Sade, Bolan, and a few others from their clique. But instead of the warm hugs and cheerful banter she expected, their reactions were cool and distant. Aisha, hi, Sade said, sipping her drink. You look different. Aisha's stomach clenched. Different? Different? How? Sade hesitated before adding, you know, just not your usual self. Are you okay? I'm fine, Aisha replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Bolanl chimed in, her tone sharp. We heard about your dad. That must be tough. Aisha nodded, struggling to maintain her composure. It's been hard, but we're managing. Managing? Said said, arching an eyebrow. I can't imagine what it's like to go from your estate to, well, wherever you live now. Kemi laughed nervously. Sade, don't be rude. It's fine, Aisha said quickly, though her chest tightened. We're adjusting. It's not as bad as people think. The conversation drifted to upcoming vacations and designer collections, topics Aisha could no longer contribute to. She felt like an outsider in a group where she used to shine. Remember that trip to Santorini? Sade said, laughing. Aisha was the life of that vacation. But now? Now what? Aisha snapped, unable to hold back. Sade's eyes widened. I just meant it's a shame we don't see that side of you anymore. Maybe because I'm going through something, Sade, Aisha said, her voice trembling. Not that any of you care. An awkward silence fell over the group. Kemi cleared her throat. Let's not do this here. Aisha, can I talk to you for a second? Kemi led Aisha to a quieter corner of the garden. What's going on? Aisha demanded. Why is everyone treating me like this? Kemi sighed, avoiding her gaze. It's not personal, Aisha. It's just things have changed. People talk. Talk about what? My father's disappearance, my family losing everything, Aisha's voice cracked. Yes, Kemi admitted softly, but also about the rumors about where your father's money came from. People are distancing themselves because they don't want to get involved. Involved in what? I didn't do anything.
I know that, but society isn't kind, Aisha. You know how it works. Aisha stared at her friend, disbelief and betrayal washing over her. You're saying I'm guilty by association? After all these years, you're turning your back on me? Kemi hesitated, her silence speaking louder than words. Aisha left the party early, tears blurring her vision as she walked to the nearest bus stop. The humiliation of being abandoned by her closest friends cut deeper than she imagined. When she got home, her mother was waiting, her expression filled with concern. How was the party? Bose asked cautiously. It was awful, Aisha replied, collapsing onto the sofa. They all treated me like I'm some pariah. Bose sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. This is a test, Aisha. You'll see who your true friends are during hard times. I thought they were my true friends, Aisha said bitterly. But they're just like everyone else, only around for the good times. Bose sighed. It's a painful lesson, but an important one. People love power and wealth, not the person behind it. The ones who stay when you have nothing are the ones who truly care. Aisha wiped her tears, the weight of her new reality pressing down on her. The gilded world she once knew was gone, and with it, the people she thought would stand by her. For the first time, she realized she was utterly alone. Aisha sat in the cramped living room of their apartment, staring at her laptop. The screen glared back at her with a notification from the bursary office. Final warning, payment due for semester fees. Her heart sank. This was the third email she had received that week, and the deadline was tomorrow. She closed the laptop and looked over at her mother, who was folding laundry on their worn-out couch. "Mummy," Aisha began hesitantly. Bose looked up, her face weary. "What is it, Aisha?" "They sent another reminder. If I don't pay the fees, they'll block me from sitting for the final exams." Bose sighed, dropping the shirt she was folding. "I've done everything I can. I even asked your uncle for help, but he said he's struggling with his own children's fees. I don't know what else to do." Aisha's stomach churned. "But, Mummy, if I don't graduate, what will I do? I can't be stuck like this." "I know, my dear," Bose said, tears welling in her eyes. "But these days, even survival feels like a luxury." The next morning, Aisha woke up to the sound of her mother pacing the living room, speaking into the phone. "I'll pay you back as soon as I can. Please, this is her future we're talking about. She's my only child," Bose pleaded. Aisha stayed in her room, unable to bear the guilt of listening. She knew her mother was begging someone for money, but the chances of success were slim. By noon, Bose entered Aisha's room, holding an envelope. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but there was a faint glimmer of relief in her eyes. "I managed to borrow enough for the fees," Bose said, handing her the envelope. "Mummy, how did you?" Aisha started, but Bose shook her head. "Don't ask. Just make sure you graduate, Aisha. That's all I want." Despite the payment, things only worsened. The lecturers had gone on strike for months, delaying the semester. When classes resumed, Aisha was already emotionally drained. She spent her nights in cramped study rooms, surrounded by students who seemed worlds apart from her now. Her meals consisted of cheap noodles and bread, a far cry from the catered lunches she used to enjoy. She avoided social gatherings and kept her head low, terrified that someone would bring up her family's downfall. One afternoon, while waiting outside the library, Aisha overheard two classmates talking. "Did you hear about Aisha Aande? Her father's disappearance ruined her life," one said. "Yeah, she used to flaunt everything, designer bags, vacations, the works. Now she's just scraping by," the other replied, laughing. Aisha clenched her fists, swallowing the lump in her throat. She didn't have the energy to confront them. The day of her final exams arrived, but instead of relief, Aisha felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She had barely studied, distracted by their financial struggles and her growing anxiety about the future. In the exam hall, she stared at the question paper, her mind blank. The once confident, vibrant Aisha was a shadow of herself. When the results were released, Aisha saw her name at the bottom of the pass list. She had scraped through by a mere fraction of a point. Back home, Bose greeted her with a tight hug. "You did it, Aisha. You're a graduate now." Aisha forced a smile, but inside she felt hollow. The joy of finishing school was overshadowed by the harsh reality that awaited her. "What's next, Mummy?" Aisha asked that evening as they sat in their tiny kitchen. Bose didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the flickering bulb overhead. "We'll figure it out, Aisha. One step at a time." But Aisha wasn't sure how many more steps they could take before the ground beneath them crumbled entirely. Aisha sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through her phone with a deep frown. Her Instagram feed was filled with pictures of former friends on luxurious vacations, flaunting designer bags and fine dining. Her thumb hovered over Kema's latest post, a group selfie in Paris. The caption read, "Living my best life." A sharp pang of jealousy and longing shot through Aisha. She tossed the phone onto her bed, staring at the peeling paint on the walls of their tiny apartment. Her degree had done little to improve their circumstances, and the whispers of her once glamorous life seemed like a cruel joke now. That evening, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Vanessa, a girl she had met briefly in her university days. Vanessa: "Hey babe, long time no see. Want to join me for drinks? My treat." Vanessa's world was alluring. The daughter of a middle-class trader, she had transformed her life into one of conspicuous wealth through questionable means. Aisha knew the rumors, sponsors, deals, and connections that came with a price. But when they met at a rooftop bar downtown, Vanessa greeted her like a long-lost sister. "Aisha!" Vanessa exclaimed, pulling her into a hug. "Look at you, still as gorgeous as ever." Aisha smiled faintly, glancing around the glitzy venue. "Vanessa, This place is expensive. Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. Please, don't even stress about it. Tonight's on me. Order whatever you like. Over cocktails and laughter, Vanessa shared stories of her success. She painted a picture of an easy, glamorous life, filled with influential men and endless opportunities. You could do this too, Aisha, Vanessa said, leaning in. You've got the looks, the charm. Why waste all that potential struggling? Aisha hesitated. I don't know, Vanessa. It doesn't seem right. Right doesn't pay the bills, darling, Vanessa replied with a sly smile. Think about it. The next morning, Aisha found herself replaying Vanessa's words. Her pride clashed with the harsh reality of their situation. Her mother's salary barely covered rent, and Aisha had nothing to her name. The turning point came a week later when her mother returned home from work, looking defeated. They've cut my hours, Bose said, sinking into a chair. We might not make rent this month, and Aisha felt a surge of anger. At the world, at her father for disappearing, and at herself for being unable to help. That night, she texted Vanessa. Aisha, I'm in. Vanessa introduced Aisha to her circle, a group of women who lived lavishly but rarely discussed how they earned their money. They hosted events at high-end clubs, mingling with wealthy businessmen and politicians. Aisha was cautious at first, but the lure of easy money and the chance to reclaim her lost status proved too tempting. Just smile and be charming, Vanessa advised one evening as they prepared for a private party. The rest will come naturally. Aisha wore a glittering dress Vanessa had lent her, the kind of outfit she hadn't been able to afford in years. As she entered the party, heads turned. For a brief moment, she felt like her old self again, confident and untouchable. The lifestyle came with strings. Late nights turned into early mornings, and the men she entertained often demanded more than just her company. At first, Aisha drew boundaries, but as her financial needs grew, those lines began to blur. Her mother noticed the changes. Aisha, where are you getting all this money from? Bose asked one evening, gesturing to the shopping bags Aisha had brought home. Friends, Aisha replied vaguely. They've been helping me out. Friends? What kind of friends? Just leave it, Mummy. Aisha snapped, storming off to her room. One night, as Aisha scrolled through her bank app, pride flickered in her chest. She had managed to send her mother enough money to cover the rent, along with a little extra for groceries. But the cost of her new life weighed heavily on her. At another party, she overheard a group of women discussing their clients in hushed tones. She's lucky he only asked for that. Some of these men are dangerous, one said, laughing nervously. Aisha froze. The veneer of glamour was cracking, revealing the dark underbelly of the world she had stepped into. The turning point came when Vanessa introduced her to a man who promised her a business opportunity. He was charming, older, and radiated power. But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and something about him made Aisha uneasy. Don't worry, Vanessa whispered. He's one of the good ones. As Aisha shook his hand, a knot formed in her stomach. She realized too late that she was in over her head. The glow of the chandelier above Aisha cast fragmented light across the opulent room. She was seated beside Mr. Bernard, the wealthy businessman Vanessa had introduced her to weeks earlier. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his every move radiating authority. Beside him, Aisha felt like an accessory, beautiful but silent, admired but insignificant. Smile more, Bernard whispered as he leaned toward her. His tone was gentle, but the underlying command was unmistakable. Aisha forced a smile, her hands gripping the clutch on her lap tightly. She had quickly learned that the life of a sugar baby was more complicated than the glittering illusion Vanessa had sold her. The demands started small: dinner dates, shopping sprees, and late-night phone calls. Bernard would gift her designer clothes and jewelry, making her feel like royalty. But as the weeks turned into months, the requests became heavier, more personal. Aisha, Bernard said one evening as they lounged in his private suite, I need you to accompany me to a conference in Dubai. I've already booked your flight. Aisha hesitated. Dubai? That's a long trip. I'd have to tell my mum something. You're an adult, Bernard replied, his tone firm. You don't owe anyone an explanation. Besides, you'll enjoy it. The thought of traveling to Dubai excited her at first, but the reality of being under Bernard's constant watch soon made her feel suffocated. Life in this world was like walking a tightrope. Bernard was not her only benefactor, but he was the most controlling. Aisha had learned that pleasing one man often meant alienating another, and the repercussions could be severe. One night, a younger man she had once entertained showed up at a party where she was with Bernard. "Aisha, I've been calling you," the man said angrily, grabbing her arm. "Let go of her," Bernard said coldly, his presence looming. The two men exchanged icy glares before the younger man stormed off, muttering curses. Bernard turned to Aisha, his expression unreadable. "You belong to me, Aisha," he said. "Remember that." The physical luxury came at the cost of her emotional well-being. Bernard's gifts filled her closet, but his possessiveness filled her with dread. Nights were often sleepless as she worried about the consequences of saying or doing the wrong thing. When Aisha confided in Vanessa, her friend shrugged. "That's the game, babe. You win some, you lose some. Just make sure you stay on the winning side." But what did winning even mean? One evening, as Aisha lay in Bernard's suite, he handed her a black box. Inside was a diamond necklace, glinting under the soft light. "Do you like it?" Bernard asked. "It's beautiful," Aisha replied, her voice hollow. "Good. Wear it tomorrow night. I'm taking you to a dinner with some important associates." The dinner turned out to be a grueling test. Bernard paraded her like a trophy, and the men at the table regarded her with a mix of admiration and objectification. She was expected to laugh at their jokes, flatter their egos, and remain poised no matter what. Afterward, Bernard praised her. "You did well tonight. I'm proud of you." But Aisha felt nothing but emptiness. The breaking point came when Bernard began dictating every aspect of her life. "I don't want you seeing Vanessa anymore," he said one afternoon. "Why?" Aisha asked, alarmed. "She's a bad influence," he said curtly, "and I don't like how she looks at me. It's disrespectful." Aisha nodded, too afraid to argue, but cutting off Vanessa left her feeling even more isolated. Her mother noticed the change in her demeanor. "Aisha, you've been so distant lately," Bose said one evening. "Is everything okay?" "I'm fine, Mummy," Aisha lied. Bose reached out to hold her hand. You know you can talk to me, right? No matter what." Aisha nodded, tears threatening to spill. But how could she explain this life to her mother? The shame, the fear, the feeling of being trapped in a golden cage. She couldn't bear to disappoint her. One night, Aisha sat in Bernard's suite, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The diamond necklace around her neck sparkled brilliantly, but her eyes were dull and lifeless. This wasn't the life she had dreamed of. But the question loomed, how could she escape? The nightclub was alive with pulsating music, swirling lights, and the hum of conversations that filled the air. Aisha sat at the corner of the VIP lounge, her golden gown glittering under the dim lighting. Bernard was hosting another one of his exclusive parties, and Aisha, as always, was expected to play the part of the dutiful companion. Her glass of champagne sat untouched on the table as she absent-mindedly scrolled through her phone, wishing for an escape. It was then that a young man approached her, carrying a casual air that stood out in the room filled with Bernard's stiff associates. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked with a disarming smile. Aisha looked up, surprised by his straightforwardness. "Sure," she replied cautiously. "I'm Femi," he said, extending his hand. "Aisha," she replied, shaking it lightly. He nodded toward the crowd. "You don't seem like you're having a good time." Aisha let out a small laugh. "I'm not much of a party person." "Then why are you here?" "Let's just say it's complicated," she said, her smile fading. Femi didn't push for more but shifted the conversation to lighter topics. He talked about the music, joked about the extravagant outfits, and even teased Aisha about her serious expression. For the first time in weeks, Aisha found herself laughing genuinely. Femi became a regular face in her life after that night. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in her as a person. Whenever they met, he brought a sense of ease that Aisha hadn't felt in years. "What do you do, Femi?" Aisha asked one evening as they sat in a quiet cafe. "I'm into logistics," he replied with a casual shrug. "That sounds vague," Aisha teased. He laughed. "It's not as exciting as it sounds. What about you?" "Me?" "I guess you could say I'm just trying to find my place," she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. Femi studied her for a moment. "Well, wherever you are, you deserve to be happy." His words lingered in her mind long after they parted ways. Unbeknownst to Aisha, Femi wasn't just a friendly stranger. He was an undercover police officer, part of a task force investigating Bernard for his involvement in human trafficking. Bernard's luxurious lifestyle and high-profile connections had long been under scrutiny. But evidence had been hard to gather. Aisha's presence in Bernard's life hadn't gone unnoticed by the authorities. They suspected she was another victim, manipulated and trapped in Bernard's web. Femi's assignment was clear: gain her trust and uncover information that could bring Bernard down. One afternoon, Aisha confided in Femi about her struggles. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life," she admitted. "It's all so empty." "Then why stay?" Femi asked gently. Aisha hesitated. "It's not that simple. There are obligations, people I can't disappoint." Femi leaned closer. "You shouldn't have to sacrifice your happiness for anyone. You deserve better, Aisha." His sincerity caught her off guard. For the first time, she felt seen, not as an accessory or a pawn, but as a person. Their bond deepened over the weeks, but Femi was careful not to reveal his true purpose. He gathered snippets of information during their conversations, piecing together the puzzle of Bernard's operations. Aisha, unaware of his ulterior motives, found solace in his friendship. One evening, as they walked along a quiet street, Femi noticed the sadness in her eyes. "Tell me something," he said. "If you could leave all this behind, what would you do?" Aisha sighed. "I'd start over. Maybe go back to school, get a real job. Something honest." "Why don't you?" "It's not that easy," she replied. "Bernard, he wouldn't just let me go." Femi's jaw tightened. Her words confirmed his suspicions about Bernard's hold over her. Back at the station, Femi shared his findings with his team. "She's not just another associate," he told his superior. "She's a victim like so many others. We need to get her out before it's too late." His superior nodded. "But tread carefully. If Bernard suspects anything, it could jeopardize the entire operation and her safety." Femi's mission became more personal with each passing day. He saw the spark in Aisha that she had buried under layers of pain and fear, and as he worked to bring Bernard down, he silently vowed to protect her at all costs. Little did Aisha know, the man she had come to trust was walking a dangerous line, one that could change both their lives forever. Aisha stood on the balcony of Bernard's penthouse, watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky. The crisp evening breeze brushed against her face, carrying the faint scent of Bernard's cologne from behind her. "You look lost in thought," Bernard said, stepping closer and handing her a glass of wine. Aisha smiled faintly. "Just thinking about how peaceful it is up here." He chuckled. "You deserve peace, Aisha, and happiness." For weeks now, Bernard had been different, softer, more attentive. He surprised her with flowers, took her to lavish dinners, and even listened when she talked about her dreams. The possessiveness that once suffocated her seemed to fade, replaced by a gentler side that made her feel safe, even cherished. "Do you have plans for next week?" Bernard asked casually. "Not really," she replied, sipping her wine. "Good," he said, a mischievous smile playing on his lips. "Pack your bags. We're going to Paris for my birthday." Aisha's heart raced at the thought. She had never been to Paris, and the idea of celebrating Bernard's birthday in one of the most romantic cities in the world filled her with excitement. "Paris?" she repeated, her eyes wide with surprise. "Yes, Paris," Bernard confirmed. "I have everything planned: luxury accommodations, private tours, the works." "You'll love it." For the first time in a long while, Aisha felt a flicker of joy that wasn't laced with fear or doubt. The flight to Paris was a whirlwind of luxury. Bernard had booked them first-class seats, complete with champagne and gourmet meals. As Aisha looked out of the window at the clouds below, she allowed herself to dream, if only for a moment, of a life where happiness came without a price. Upon arrival, they were whisked away to a grand hotel overlooking the Eiffel Tower. The room was adorned with fresh flowers, and a chilled bottle of champagne awaited them. "This is incredible," Aisha whispered, running her fingers over the intricate lace curtains framing the windows. "Only the best for you," Bernard said, his voice warm. Over the next few days, Bernard showed her a side of him she hadn't seen before. They strolled hand in hand along the Seine, explored art galleries, and dined at the finest restaurants. Bernard's attention to detail and his genuine effort to make her happy began to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. One evening, as they stood beneath the glittering lights of the Eiffel Tower, Bernard turned to her. "You've made me so proud, Aisha," he said, his eyes sincere. "I know I haven't always shown it, but you mean a lot to me." Aisha's throat tightened. The man standing before her felt like a stranger compared to the cold, controlling Bernard she had known. "Thank you," she said softly. The night of Bernard's birthday was a grand affair. He had rented out a historic chateau just outside the city, inviting an elite crowd to celebrate with him. Aisha wore a stunning emerald gown that Bernard had chosen for her, and as they entered the ballroom, all eyes were on them. "You look breathtaking," Bernard whispered as he guided her through the crowd. The evening was filled with laughter, music, and champagne. Bernard's associates greeted Aisha warmly, and for the first time, she felt like she truly belonged in his world. As the night drew to a close, Bernard pulled Aisha aside to a quiet corner of the chateau. "I want to make you a promise," he said, his tone serious. Aisha looked at him curiously. "What kind of promise?" "To always take care of you, to give you the life you deserve." Her heart swelled with emotion, and for a fleeting moment she believed him. But as they returned to the ballroom, a familiar face in the crowd caught her attention. Femi. He stood near the bar, his expression unreadable as his eyes met hers. Aisha's stomach churned. What was he doing here? Her mind raced with questions, but she forced herself to smile and focus on Bernard. After all, this was his night, and she couldn't let anything ruin it. Yet, deep down, she knew that the shadows of her past were never far behind. The private jet touched down in Lagos as the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. Aisha leaned back in her seat, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and contentment. Paris had been magical, and for the first time in years she felt like she had caught a glimpse of a better life. Bernard, seated across from her, looked calm, sipping his whiskey. He had been unusually quiet since they boarded the plane, but Aisha chalked it up to his exhaustion from the extravagant birthday celebrations. "Ready to head home?" Aisha asked, her voice light. Bernard smiled faintly. "Not quite yet, my dear. There is one more thing I need to handle first." Aisha tilted her head, confused. "What do you mean?" "You'll see," he replied cryptically, reaching out to take her hand. Instead of driving toward the upscale neighborhood where Bernard's mansion stood, their car headed in the opposite direction. The streets grew narrower, the surroundings less familiar. Aisha's initial confusion gave way to unease. "Bernard, where are we going?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "It's a surprise," he said smoothly, but his tone lacked the warmth she had grown used to. The car pulled into a secluded industrial area, lined with towering warehouses. Aisha's heart pounded as Bernard stepped out and motioned for her to follow. "Bernard, this doesn't feel right," she said, hesitating. "Trust me," he said, his smile cold. The moment Aisha stepped inside the warehouse, her blood ran cold. The space was dimly lit, filled with rows of shipping containers and a handful of unfamiliar men standing around. The air smelled of oil and metal, and the tension was palpable. "Bernard," she whispered, her voice shaking, "what is this place?" He didn't answer. Instead, he nodded to one of the men, who stepped forward with a grim expression. "Take her," Bernard said, his tone devoid of emotion. Aisha's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? Bernard, what are you talking about? You've been a good distraction, Aisha," he said, his voice cold. "But this is business." "No," Aisha cried, backing away. "Please, Bernard, don't do this." The men advanced toward her, and Aisha's pleas grew more desperate. "Bernard, I trusted you. I thought you cared about me." Bernard's expression didn't waver. "Caring doesn't pay the bills, Aisha. You'll fetch a good price. That's the only thing that matters." The men grabbed her arms as she screamed and struggled. "Let me go. Please, Bernard, don't do this." Her cries echoed through the warehouse, but Bernard didn't flinch. He turned away, his back to her, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. "Put her in the container," he ordered, his voice flat. The men dragged Aisha toward a large shipping container. She thrashed and kicked, tears streaming down her face. "Please, someone help me!" Her voice cracked with desperation, but there was no one to hear her. As the heavy metal doors of the container slammed shut, Aisha was plunged into darkness. She banged on the walls, her sobs echoing in the confined space. "Why?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "How could he do this to me?" Outside, Bernard lit a cigarette, his face void of remorse. "Make sure she's ready for the shipment tomorrow," he told the men. One of them nodded. "What about her connections? Anyone might come looking for her?" Bernard smirked. "She's a nobody now. No one will care." But unknown to Bernard, someone did care. Femi, the undercover officer, had been tracking Bernard's movements since Paris. He had noticed the deviation in their route and followed them discreetly. From the shadows outside the warehouse, he watched the scene unfold, his jaw tightening with anger. He stepped back into the cover of darkness, pulling out his phone. "This is Femi," he whispered. "We've got a situation. I need backup immediately." Aisha's fate seemed sealed, but Femi was determined to ensure Bernard didn't get away with his crimes. The clock was ticking, and every second counted. Femi crouched behind an abandoned truck, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His eyes stayed locked on the dimly lit warehouse, where Bernard's men moved with unsettling calm. "This is Officer Femi," he whispered. "I'm at the warehouse near Ajagunle docks. Bernard has trafficked girls locked inside. I need immediate backup." "We're mobilizing units now," the voice on the other end replied. "Stay put. Do not engage until we arrive." Femi ended the call, his mind racing. Time was slipping away, and every second spent waiting gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the image of Aisha's terrified face from earlier that evening. Inside the container, Aisha huddled in a corner, her knees pulled to her chest. Around her, other girls sobbed quietly, their faces pale with fear. "Do you think anyone will come for us?" A young girl beside her whispered. Aisha swallowed the lump in her throat. "Someone has to," she said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. Femi's pulse quickened as he saw the faint glimmer of blue and red lights in the distance. Reinforcements had arrived. The tactical team moved swiftly and silently, surrounding the warehouse. Femi briefed them on the situation, pointing out key entry points and the likely locations of Bernard's men. "Remember," Femi said, his voice low but firm, "the girls' lives come first. We take Bernard and his men alive, if possible, but no risks to the victims." The commanding officer nodded. "Understood. Let's move." The first sign of trouble for Bernard's men was the sudden, deafening crack of the warehouse doors being kicked open. Flashlights pierced the darkness as officers stormed in, their voices commanding. "Police! Drop your weapons!" Chaos erupted. Bernard's men scrambled, some reaching for guns, others attempting to flee. Shots rang out, the deafening echoes reverberating through the cavernous space. Femi moved with precision, his focus razor-sharp. He darted toward the container he had seen Aisha being dragged into. "Aisha!" he shouted, banging on the metal doors. Inside, Aisha's heart leapt at the sound of his voice. "Femi, we're in here," she screamed, her voice hoarse but desperate. Femi signaled to another officer, who rushed over with bolt cutters. The heavy lock clattered to the ground and Femi yanked the doors open. The girls blinked against the harsh light, their expressions a mix of fear and hope. "Come on, you're safe now," Femi said, his voice steady but gentle. Aisha stumbled out, her legs weak. The moment her eyes met Femi's, tears spilled down her cheeks. "You came," she whispered. "I promised I'd look out for you," Femi said, his tone soft but resolute. "Let's get you out of here." Meanwhile, Bernard was cornered in an office at the back of the warehouse. He held a pistol, his face contorted with fury as officers surrounded him. "It's over, Bernard," the lead officer said. "Drop the weapon," Bernard sneered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "We know exactly who you are," the officer replied. "And we have enough evidence to put you away for life. Don't make this worse." After a tense standoff, Bernard finally lowered his gun. Two officers restrained him as he glared at Femi from across the room. "You think you've won?" Bernard spat. "This isn't over." Femi didn't respond. His focus was on Aisha, who sat wrapped in a blanket near the paramedics. As the night wore on, the warehouse was secured, and the girls were transported to safety. Aisha sat in the back of an ambulance, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of water. Femi approached her, his expression filled with both relief and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said. "Just focus on healing. You've been through enough." Aisha nodded, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope, fragile but real. As Bernard was escorted into a police van, his expression darkened. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath.